Josh, do you want to lead a prayer? Okay. Josh, lead us in our opening prayer.
Father, this afternoon we have given us to be able to gather together this morning so that according to the word, Father, we ask you to give us as students in class this morning to be able to focus on what we're studying. It presents as material that is prepared to us. Father, we ask you, all the teachers and all the kids in the back, we ask you to do this throughout the rest of the service and go to December and December.
Thank you, Josh. The reason I ask if you want to lead a prayer is because I failed to talk to you before class. And I don't want anybody to ever lead a prayer who feels uncomfortable or who doesn't feel well that day. So that's my strategy. All right, we are on page 17 of our notes. Point number 16b. The apostles and Jesus are headed from Capernaum to Nain, Nain. And they notice as they get close to the gates of the city, a funeral procession. And they joined this funeral procession because in Judaism, everybody joined a funeral procession and a wedding procession. Didn't matter what you were doing. Two exceptions: pregnant women and those studying the law. They were in the synagogue studying the law, and nothing could disturb the study of the law. It came first. As they approach this wedding procession, this funeral procession, we preachers get weddings and funerals all mixed up. Jesus goes up and touches the bier, or the couch, the gurney, the stretcher, whatever you want to call it. Last week, Stan and I were talking, and I said the traditional pallbearers today derive from the Jewish funeral. There were several things that we took from the Jewish funeral and have adapted them to our funerals today. Stan said that the pall today, and this is based upon his experience with Catholic funerals, is the draping over the casket. I did not know that. I do know that in Judaism, early Judaism, they never covered a body. They exposed the body so that all those who were in the procession could see the decedent on that gurney. Some will call it a coffin, but it is not a coffin with sides that will hide the body, or never was there a lid. It was all, they were always face up with their hands folded and exposed to the elements. They were wrapped, just like mummies. They were wrapped in linen cloths. The preferable wrapping for a decedent would be the wrappings that the scroll of the Torah was wrapped in. The Torah being the law, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Every synagogue had a Torah closet. And the ruler of the synagogue would go into that Torah closet and get from a box they called the ark, no cover on it. The scrolls were standing up. He would get the scrolls. He would bring them out and present them to the reader. So the Torah wrappings to protect them were done away with every few months. And these wrappings were preserved for the wrappings of a deceased body. In our funeral processions, we see generally the funeral director leading the procession, then the preacher, then the pallbearers carrying the casket, and then everybody else. In Judaism, the mourners went first. These were the mourning women. Now, you had to hire, the poorest person, as I've said before, had to hire at least one musician and 2 mourners. A musician could be a man or a woman, but the mourners could only be women. And they led the procession. Coming after them was the orator, the preacher, whatever you want to call him, and he is announcing what the decedent did in his life, praising him. Then the decedent was carried, was the third in the procession, carried by 4 to 6 men on staves, because they could not touch the bier. They could not get close in touching the decedent, much like they carried the Ark of the Covenant. They had to carry it on their shoulders on staves so that their hands could be free from defilement. After that, the women followed in the procession. That is in Galilee, and that's where we are. Nain is in Galilee. In Judea, the women preceded the casket. Why? Why did the women have to go in front of the casket in Judea, but not in Galilee? Galileans were considered second-rate Jews anyway. All right? Because they believed that the woman introduced sin into the world, and that she, therefore, should be leading death. Sin caused that person to die. And therefore, the woman who brought that sin into the world ought to lead that decedent. But they didn't have this mentality in Galilee. And then after that were the relatives of the decedent. And then after that were the friends of the decedent. And then finally, bringing up the rear, was the multitude, some of whom may not have even known the decedent. So that was the procession as it was in first century Judaism. Any questions? Let me mention a few things about death that I didn't get to last week. After the decedent was buried, and 90% of them were put in what? What was their burial? A tomb, a sepulcher, and what was that sepulcher? No, that's not right, Landry. All right. What was it? It was a hole dug into the rock, the side. It could be a natural cave, or it could be a hollowed out, by man cave. And inside, how many niches were there? How many bodies could be buried in one sepulcher? All right, 8. 3 on each side, and then 2 on the back wall. All right, now, a few months later, well, maybe even a couple of years, after the body rotted, they would go back into that sepulcher and extract the bones. And I know I feel the same way. And extract the bones and put them in a little box called an ossuary. Ossuary. Archaeologists have found several ossuaries. One has the name Mary on it. They don't have last names. One has the name Joseph on it. And on we can go. I don't remember some of the other names because it's been years and years before I delved into this. Atheists are always putting the Bible down, always. They have yet to give a credible, academic, intelligible refutation of anything in the Scriptures. Archaeologists have found almost every conceivable thing that could neutralize the argument of the infidel. Once these things are found and corroborated, do you think that's going to change the infidelic mentality? No, it won't change it. They'll just jump on something else. A few years later, archaeologists find something to confirm that. So they just change horses again and get on something else. I had a man tell me one time, if y'all had music in the churches of Christ I would attend. Do you think he meant that? No, he didn't mean that. He didn't mean that at all. Right. We just don't have mechanical. Exactly. That's right, Terry. And they, bless their hearts, they don't understand this, Terry. They don't understand that music doesn't require an instrumental, piece at all. All right. On the Sabbath, I mean, at a funeral site, before they bury or inter a baby, if that baby is uncircumcised, they circumcise him right there at the graveside, because they cannot bury an uncircumcised person. They will not. The Jews believed that the dead body had a degree of consciousness. He had to be buried, and they were always buried in the evening on the same day that they died. In that kind of climate over there, there was no other choice. And so they had to bury that person, because if they didn't bury the person, the soul could not find its way back into that body. I'm telling you, this is how they thought. Might not make sense to us. So they bury this person, and the spirit finds its way back into that person, and that person is dead, but he's conscious. They didn't have a very clear picture of the soul apple. David said about his son who died, he can't come to me, but I can go to him. That was a gray area. They didn't really understand what Sheol was. And it's not exactly the same as Hades today, which I've heard some people say. There's a world of difference. Sheol was in the earth. Hades is not. Why did they come to the grave on the third day? For example, Mary Magdalene went to the grave of Jesus, the sepulcher, on the third day to anoint the body. But there are other incidents. Why was the on the third day, not the first or the second day? Pardon? They had to make sure, because they have because they didn't embalm people. You gone anyway. So they had, it stands right, they had to make sure that the person was truly dead, and they sealed it on the third day, except for Jesus, because he had prophesied his own resurrection, and they did not want that to take place. Do you know what a Sabbath day's journey is? The Jews believed that on the Sabbath, they could not travel more than 2,000 feet, okay? 2,000 feet. I can give you the background on that, but it requires another lesson with regard to the Levitical cities. These Levites were given these cities plus 2,000 feet north and south, east and west for their animals and for their crops and things like that. And that's what sustained them, plus the 10% or the tithe from the people. But on the Sabbath day, and so you couldn't go beyond a Sabbath day's journey, that's 0.6 of a mile, except when you were burying someone. You could go beyond that. That was the one exception in Judaism. Here's the thing about how the Jews circumvented their own laws. First of all, they couldn't travel more than 2,000 cubits. I should have said cubits a while ago instead of feet. 2,000 cubits being 3,000 feet. On the Sabbath day, that was man-made law. God did not dictate this. But they knew how to circumvent that. Let's say that this is, Wayne, would you hold that up? All right. That's the city of Jerusalem. They always made the city a square. Even if it was a round city, they made a square out of it, and that circles on the ends. And the 2,000 cubits was to be reckoned from the point, from any of the points. So here's one point. They could go 2,000 cubits. If on the previous Friday they had planted a sack lunch there, that would be construed as their habitat. So they could go 2,000 cubits from that. If they they could take a piece of board and extend it, and that would be their dwelling. I'm telling you, they could circumvent anything. And this is what Jesus was he had to fight this all the time. As I've said before, whatever Jesus said or whatever he did, he lost. Because there were Jews on both sides. The followers of Hillel and followers of Shammai, if he wasn't condemned by the one, he was condemned by the other. He could never win. All right. Any questions? No questions? You girls don't have any questions? All right. Have you ever noticed in what direction a body is laid in our cemeteries? Always facing east. That's because we got that from the Jews. Always facing east. The face is always toward the east because they believed that the Messiah was coming from the east. And that these bodies would be raised, and they wanted them raised so that they were facing the Messiah or the Master, if you will. They also had a little bottle, and they would pass it around to all the mourners. And I don't know how they did this, but every mourner would put one teardrop in that bottle. And they'd pass it on down, and that bottle would be full. And they would bury that bottle with the decedent so that God would see how well loved they were and how brokenhearted the survivors were. The Jews are a very, very fascinating and somewhat humorous kind of people. In your processions, the sexes were always separated. Men and women did not mix. So there were the men who were ahead, and then the women were behind, or vice versa if it was in Judea. All right. No questions? Let's get into Herod Antipas, point number 17. Herod Antipas incarcerated or imprisoned one of the greatest men to ever grace this earth. Who was that man besides Jesus? John the Baptizer. And John, the beloved apostle, was very, very close to these men. John the Baptist he preached in 3 different places on the Jordan River. He preached beyond Bethany, which was at the southern end of the Sea of Galilee. He preached at Aenon, which was somewhat in the vicinity where Galilee and Samaria meet their border. And then he baptized in the northern end of the Dead Sea, which has no name. We have only the location on this. When John was baptizing in the southern end of the Sea of the Jordan River, before it went into the Dead Sea, that's where Jesus was baptized. Okay. Just on the other side of the Jordan, where the land and the water meet, that was the territory of Herod Antipas, which was Perea. He was also Tetrarch of Galilee. He was given 2 territories. So you have Archelaus, who is over Judea. Then you have Antipas, his brother, who is over Galilee and Perea. The capital of Antipas's territory was in Perea. It was called Machaerus. And that's where John was incarcerated. Archaeologists today have uncovered a dungeon in Machaerus with the chains still in the wall. And this, no doubt, has to be where John was incarcerated. Herod Antipas was on his way to Rome to visit with Emperor Caligula. He was friends with Caligula. He was not the king of Judea like his father was. Archelaus and Antipas wanted to become king. That's the name of the game. When my king daddy dies, I want to be king. Well, the old reprobate, Herod the Great, changed his will several times. And he would appoint one, then he would change it and appoint the other, and this would cause division in the family. One time, Philip, he had two sons named Philip. There was Philip, and then Herod Philip, and then Philip the Tetrarch. And then he changed it and gave this Philip, Herod Philip, nothing but money. That's all he had. He was married to a woman by the name of Herodias. Herodias and Jezebel, the two most wicked women in the Bible. Antipas was married to a woman by the name of Photius. Her daddy was the king of the Arabians. Aretas, the king of the Arabians. So, on his way to Rome, Antipas crosses the Jordan and goes through Jerusalem and visits his brother Herod Philip. Remember, he's not a tetrarch, he's no ruler. On his way to Rome, he encounters Philip's wife, and they start Googling each other. And I don't mean on the internet, all right? And they have an affair. So they promise that when Antipas comes back from Rome, they will divorce their spouses. Philip would divorce Herodias. Antipas would divorce Photius. They would marry each other. Herodias was Antipas's niece. And so Photius asked if she could go down to one of the fortified cities in around the Dead Sea, and Antipas said yes. Well, she scooted on into Arabia where her daddy was. She went back home, and I certainly don't blame her. Herodias was the death knell of Antipas. Number one, she caused Antipas to behead John the Baptist. Antipas didn't want to do that. He was fearful of killing John. He was fearful of God, and he was fearful of the multitude. But she talked him into it. When she first approached him, he wouldn't kill her. Then she came up with this plan. She would have her daughter, Salome, to dance a very, very passionate dance around the passions of Antipas, such that he promised her anything up to what? The half of his kingdom. She didn't want anything. So she runs to mommy. And what does mama say? You ask for the head of John the Baptist. That's exactly what she does. Herod made this rash promise in the presence of witnesses. He had to go through with it. And that explains why John was beheaded. Antipas would never have killed him. Secondly, she caused a war between Antipas and Aretas. Aretas waged war against Antipas for doing what he did, and he beat him soundly. Thirdly, when Antipas went to Rome to try to get Caligula to make him the king of Judea, there were others who followed him to Rome, and they objected on the basis, number one, he was a rat. But secondly, they said, he is planning to go to war against you, O emperor. Upon investigation, Caligula found that Antipas had already stockpiled 70,000 weapons of war. He was in cahoots with the king of Parthia. The Parthians were just as strong as the Romans were, and they were going to topple the Romans. And so instead of killing him, Caligula banished him to lions. And Herodias went there too, and he committed suicide. So let's get back to John. We don't know the particulars involved in his incarceration, but we do know one thing. he publicly denounced the marriage of Antipas and Herodias, and that ticked Antipas off, but not enough to kill him. But it ticked Herodias off enough that she wanted him dead. Now, do you think that those immoral, unscrupulous rats who had no morals at all, do you think it bothered them that John said, "You're living in adultery"? That didn't bother them at all. So what was it that ticked Antipas and Herodias off? The Torah says that a person in an illicit relationship cannot serve as king. He was killed for treason. He was not killed for exposing their adultery. Killed for treason. Now, if you will, turn to Luke chapter 4. And I want you in Luke chapter 4 and Luke chapter 7. In Luke chapter 4, John is not a prisoner. In Luke chapter 7, he is a prisoner. So in Luke chapter 4, Jesus, notice verse 16, and he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and he entered, as his custom was, into the synagogue on the Sabbath and stood up to read. Notice, all the readers stood up. Teachers sat down, okay, in the synagogue. Now in verse 18, here's what, he took the book of Isaiah, and here's what he reads. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the good tidings to the poor, number one. He hath sent me to proclaim release to the captives, number two, and recovering of sight to the blind, number three, and to set at liberty them that are bruised, number four, and number five, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. Now, turn to Luke 7. In Luke 7, John sends his disciples to Jesus and asks, "Are you the one that should come, or should we look for another?" What's your view on John questioning the messiahship of Jesus when he baptized Jesus? He saw the Spirit come down upon him. The Spirit of God entered into Jesus. He knew he was the Son of God, and they were cousins. But now he says, "I want to know if you're the one or if there is another." The word "another" means another of a different kind. When you're in prison, your thinking is not going to be normal. You're going to be totally distressed and stressed out. That was the problem with John. He's in a dungeon. He's chained. Day in and day out, he sees nothing but darkness and fed only scraps. That's going to discombobulate your thinking. And so he says, "I want y'all to go see if he is the one who should come." Instead of Jesus telling John's disciples, "Yes, tell him I am," here's what he says. Verse 20, "And when the men were come unto him, they said, John the Baptist hath sent us unto thee, saying, Art thou he that cometh, or look we for another? In that hour he cured many of diseases and plagues and evil spirits, and on many that were blind he bestowed sight." All right? In other words, tell him about the works that this man has been doing. "And he answered and said unto them, Go and tell John the things which ye have seen and heard." Now, remember from the other reading, the blind receive their sight, number one. The lame walk, number two. The lepers are cleansed, number three. The deaf hear, number four. The dead are raised, number five. and the poor have the good tidings preached unto them. He adds a couple of points. All these are taken from Isaiah, by the way, okay? There's one thing he didn't mention in Luke 7 that he mentioned in Luke 4. That's right, to preach liberty to the captives. That's what John wanted to hear. Why didn't Jesus mention that? Because he knew John would die in prison. He was not going to build his hopes up and say, liberty to the captives. John would say, oh, good, I'm going to be freed. He couldn't. He could not preach that. And that's just like us today giving false hope to those who are Christians. I think I was talking to Dale the other day, and I've had people out of Christ tell me what it's going to be like in heaven. And this wrenches my soul. And I go ahead and tell them. But I know they're not going to enter heaven. And I don't want to give them false hope. It's just you've been in that situation, Carl. And many of you, it's just a terrible thing. All right. So now we have one of the greatest men who ever graced this earth to die. Like I said Wednesday night in the devotional, like those souls in Revelation 6:10 who died for the testimony of Christ and for the Word of God. And that same persecution is going on in the world today. Carl has mentioned a family in Africa, Sri Lanka or something. I mean, I don't know if it's Africa or Sri Lanka, wherever. And I know of others. I pray every night for those who are being persecuted for the testimony of Christ. Every night. And even in Canada, the church is being assaulted. Of all countries, I would never have thought Canada would be one. But they are. Now, the next thing we're going to get into is found on page 18, number 22. The 12 returned, and the Lord went with them to the eastern side of the lake. Here we have the feeding of the 5,000. Carl, would you mind passing some of these out on that side and Dale on this side? Or Wayne, whoever. Thank you. Jesus fed the 5,000 on one occasion. He fed the 4,000 on another occasion. The 5,000 were Jews. The 4,000 were Gentiles. He fed the 5,000 in Bethsaida of Julius on the eastern side of the Jordan River on the northern end of the Sea of Galilee. And he fed the 4,000 in the Decapolis, which was a heathen Gentile country. So there are a lot of differences. I guess I ought to take a lesson, Dale. I have mine at home. I guess I better, or y'all can read it to me. Thank you. There were two towns named Bethsaida. Bethsaida means fisher town. There was Bethsaida of Galilee. And by the way, you will not find this on a map. I need maps, and I have never yet found Bethsaida of Galilee. And yet John 12:21 specifically says Bethsaida of Galilee. So there are at least two, because we know he's on the eastern side now, from your perspective, the eastern side. And Galilee is on the western side. The latter originally was just a village that Tetrarch Philip, now remember, there was Herod Philip in Jerusalem, no ruler, just a wealthy man, which wasn't good enough for Herodias. And then there was Tetrarch Philip, who was given the Bashan area northeast of the Sea of Galilee. It lies just within the territory of Tetrarch Philip, just before the stream enters into the Sea of Galilee. The Passover was near, as pointed out in the green grass of Mark 6:39. He's the only writer who talks about the green grass. Mark is known as the vivid gospel writer. He throws in details that the other gospel writers do not throw in. You might say, I saw a dog chase a kid the other day. John is going to say, I saw a German shepherd chase that kid the other day. He's going to be more specific or more vivid, if you will. All right. In such a climate, there would be no green grass even shortly after the Passover. When was the Passover? Basically, April. Okay? Latter part of March, early part of April. And so there would not be any green grass at that time over there. A few hours' sail from Capernaum lay the district of Bethsaida of Galilee, and that's where the apostles and Jesus are right now. It's called a desert place, but the word desert doesn't mean dry and sandy area. It simply means there aren't many people who live there. That's all the word desert means. Now, when the news of John's death reached Jesus, he and his apostles left Capernaum and sailed privately to that desert place, to Bethsaida of Galilee. The multitude knew where they were going, and so they hurried around the north end of the sea to meet them. So here's the Sea of Galilee up here, kind of narrows at the top, and Jesus and the apostles are sailing right across that northern cone. Well, these pilgrims, on their way to the Passover in Jerusalem, they cross over and they beat them there because they are kind of in a run as they are going around that northern end of the Dead Sea. Some of them even reached the place before Jesus and the apostles, but the bulk of the people arrived later. The number swelled to 5,000 men, besides women and children. Have you ever thought about the size of the crowd? These were 5,000 men. When you're going to the Passover in Jerusalem, you take your family. We're dealing with a minimum of 25,000 people. And they were fed with 5 loaves and 2 fishes because the master was passing that bread and that fish out. All right, I've got to find my place. The ford that the people crossed was about 2 miles from where the river enters the lake. So we're 2 miles north of the northern end of the Dead Sea. Near a mile further, on that wide plain of green grass, would be the scene of this great miracle. Jesus went up into a mountain and there sat with his disciples, John 6:3. And Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion toward them, and he healed their sick. He went into a mountain, and that's where they fed the 5,000. Luke says they were on a plain, Plain. Matthew says a mountain. So what's the explanation? You know there are no contradictions. Exactly. So the mountain comes down like this, and it goes out like this. He finds that level place right there. And so it can be the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain, depending upon your perspective. Wayne, I'm going to have you stand up here and point to where I last left. Having gathered them together, Jesus has the multitude sit down by companies, in ranks by hundreds and by 50s. And when the day was now far spent, that was after high noon, from what the Greek says, he turned to Philip with the question, whence shall we buy bread that these may eat? Now, why did he ask Philip that? Didn't Jesus know the answer? Certainly he knew the answer. He was testing Philip. He was always testing his apostles because they were so slow to catch on. They were with him 3 years, and they still didn't understand the resurrection until after he had appeared following his resurrection. Philip said 200 pennyworth, that's $35 U.S. money, of bread is not sufficient for them that everyone may take a little. Even if they took a little, that's not enough. The sun was declining when the disciples asked the Lord to dismiss the people. So here we have these people who were there one day. They were there 3 days for the feeding of the 4,000. But they were there one day for the feeding of the 5,000. And toward evening, the disciples say, Lord, get them away, shoo them away. You see, the disciples were always troubled about the mamas and daddies bringing their babies to Jesus and the crowds around Jesus. Jesus was never troubled with all that. And this shows you again their lack of faith at this point in their ministry together. Yes. And an earthly king is not troubled by all these flies. And Jesus diffused that, didn't he? In fact, the Greek language shows that Jesus got angry when he told the disciples, for the children not to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. He was angry. So he was angry at least twice in his ministry at that point, and then when he chased the money changers out of the temple. The sun was declining. They were not to buy. Notice, Jesus, I don't want to read that sentence. They were not to buy, but rather give what they already had. Andrew told him about a youngster who had 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes. Now, when we read about barley loaves, be it remembered that these people were among the poorest. Barley bread was proverbially the meanest or the poorest of all grains. What was the greatest? Wheat. Whenever those 3 strangers came to Abraham, he had Sarah make 3 measures of wheaten bread, the very best bread. And that's a 3-month supply of bread for 4 guys. All right, barley bread was proverbially the poorest. Now, the Greek word for fish here is a saurion, which properly means what is eaten along with bread. It especially refers to the small and generally dried pickled fish eaten with bread like our sardines. And this was one of the fish in the Sea of Galilee, a little sardine-like fish. There were 4 kinds of fish in the sea. The Greek word refers to a savory dish. I don't have time to get into all of this. Look at verse. See my little asterisk there? When they were full, each disciple filled his basket to the brim with the fragments left over. These were wicker baskets of the poorest kind. The Greek term showing that this was a Jewish feeding. Let me just go ahead and summarize the rest. The kids will be here in a minute. There are 2 words, Greek words for basket. In the feeding of the 4,000, it was a spiris, S-P-U-R-I-S. In the feeding of the 5,000, it was a kophinos, K-O-P-H-I-N-O-S. Kophinos was strictly a Jewish basket that held only enough for that one day, whereas a spiris was a Gentile basket, which was a hamper. A small frame man could crawl in that basket, and they carried supplies for several days' journey. And this is clearly understood in the circle of scholarly research. I've had friends of mine who said, "No, I don't believe that." Well, if you're going to reject something, let's reject it academically. So we definitely know on the basis of the kinds of baskets, the different crowds that were being fed. The fragments that were taken up were not crumbs that fell like you're eating some rich crackers on your couch and crumbs that fall. No, these were big portions. These were the same portions Jesus broke off and gave to them. And they took up that many more because Jesus was mass producing them with his miraculous power. All right. Thank you all very much.